It is a great honor for me to be able to chair the last session of this really interesting conference, and it is especially a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce our distinguished speaker, our keynote speaker for the last session, Dr. Chili Aboya-Suji. Dr. Chili Aboya-Suji is a distinguished international jurist at the moment at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University. He served as a judge at the International Criminal Court in The Hague from 2012 to 2021, and he was president of the court from 2018 to 2021, where at the same time, of course, he served as a senior judge in the appeals division of the International Criminal Court. Prior to joining the International Criminal Court, Judge Aboya-Suji has served as legal advisor to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. We anchored the High Commissioner's interventions in cases involving human rights questions. In that capacity, he led the writing of amicus curiae submissions to the European Court of Human Rights and the United States Supreme Court. He served as principal appeals counsel for the prosecution in the Charles Taylor case at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and has held several posts at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, including head of chambers and lead prosecution trial counsel. Before joining the International Public Service, Judge Aboya-Suji practiced law before the courts in both Canada and Nigeria. He obtained his Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Amsterdam, Master of Laws from McGill University, and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Calabar in Nigeria. He has held visiting professorships and fellowships at the University of Windsor, at UCLA, Stanford, the University of Toronto, and Harvard University. He has many publications, and the most relevant one for us at the moment is his groundbreaking book on the international law and sexual violence in armed conflicts. So thank you very much for being with us, and you have the floor.
Great honor indeed for me to be here. I would have very much loved to have appeared in person, but when the war started expanding, my family and I thought it would be best for me to speak to you from Toronto. Before getting to the meat of the discussion, I must say that it was a deliberate decision on my part to be part of this conference. As some of you may know, in North America, I live in Toronto now, and in North America, there has been that movement to ostracize, as it were, Israeli universities. I do not at all subscribe to that view. I firmly am of the view that governments all over the world do funny things, foolish things, sometimes disastrous things, and we cannot blame the universities for what their governments do. So we cannot hold the Israeli academics responsible for the policies of their government. Having said that, I also must recognize that some of the anxiety has to do with the deplorable destruction of Gaza universities, and it remains that deplorable. That must be said. Now, getting to the subject of today's discussion, the topic I want to speak to would be the doctrinal foundations of international criminal jurisdictions. I will speak to it from the perspective, obviously, of the latest movement from the International Criminal Court, the ICC, where I used to serve, uh, an arrest warrant announced against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, which provoked, by the way, a certain reaction from the French government that I've written about. Some of you may know that about the last week or so, I published a piece in Lawfare, the American platform, current affairs platform on rule of law and security, discussing the implausible premises of the French government's announcement suggesting that there may be immunity for officials of states whose states are not party to the Rome Statute. It is indeed an implausible proposition. I did not in the lawfare article get into the question of immunity of apex officials of states charged with international crimes before international tribunals. I did not get into that. And by the way, David, the latest publication of mine is the one you see there, The End of Immunity. It came out in October. Full title, End of Immunity, Holding World Leaders Accountable for Aggression, Genocide, War Crimes, and Crimes Against Humanity. I did not discuss that in the lawfare piece. So anybody who was interested in that discussion will read it in the book. International law has never recognized immunity for anyone before international criminal tribunals when the person is charged with war crimes. That has never happened in the history of international law. Again, the discussion is fully made in the book. But what I'm going to engage today is the story beyond that, the French government's counterwave, as it were. But I must say that it isn't only the French government that has signaled that kind of, shall we call it, double standards. And the reason I call it that is that because that is what it is. There are 9 arrest warrants or requests arrest warrants, including one request for arrest warrants against the leader of Myanmar, Min Aung Hlaing, that the prosecutor had announced. And so all told, 9 outside of the African accused persons or indictees, people against whom arrest warrants are outstanding. Everybody else would be African, but then beyond those, there are 9 who are not African. And the interesting division you've seen in that would be you have the 8 persons from Russia, including President Putin and his Minister of Children's Affairs, Lvova Belova, and 6 others of their colleagues who are facing, for whom the ICC has issued arrest warrant. You have 8 of them from Russia, at least. And then you have Min Aung Hlaing of Myanmar requested. For those, there has not been any protest from governments in the Western states. Many of them welcomed the arrest warrants against the Russian leaders and said that's what the law demands, that's what justice demands, notwithstanding that Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute, very much exactly like Israel. But then when we have 2 arrest warrants against Israeli nationals, we have protests from some states, talks about, well, does the ICC have jurisdiction over not officials of states, not states parties to the Rome Statute? That is what I call the double standards. Now, from this point, I am going to share my screen with you to present the rest of the talk from there. Hold on a minute, okay. So, we're gonna begin with some resonance of my off-screen discussion briefly with my friend Professor Kretschmer. Here's a quote from Robert H. Jackson, whom many of us know, in a very important article he wrote in 1945, The Rule of Law Amongst Nations. Robert Jackson complained that the trouble about international law, the rule of international law, the trouble has been that the advocates of international law have had too little of what Mr. Justice Holmes called fire in the belly, while the extreme nationalists have had too little else. Something for all of us who care about the state of international law to keep in mind. Do we have enough fire in the belly to sustain that project? Just an opening thought. Now, but back to my original, my starting point about the double standards we see. At some point, the world and we academics have to decide whether the choice we have is between what I call the extreme nationalist dogma, right, and to the effect of what Mr. Khan said somebody said to him, which is, this court was built for Africa and for thugs like Putin and not for the West and their allies. So that is one view, the extreme nationalist view. Do we prefer that, or should we choose what I call the Jackson doctrine after Robert H. Jackson, who, in the same piece I mentioned earlier, said, again, I strongly recommend folks to read that piece in the American Journal of International Law, Rule of Law Amongst Nations. Here we have Jackson saying, well, it is, after he considered the views of extreme nationalists, such as the one I mentioned earlier from that someone told Mr. Khan, Jackson says, it is futile to think, as extreme nationalists do, that we can have an international law that is always working on our side. It is futile to think that we can have international courts that will always render the decisions we want to promote our interests, and we cannot successfully cooperate with the rest of the world in establishing a reign of law unless we are prepared to have that law sometimes operate against what would be, will not be in a national advantage, so to speak. So that was Robert H. Jackson back in 1945. Now, we can move further back to this anxiety we all feel today about the shape of international law. What do we do? We have Omar de Vitale again register some of the anxieties we see today. Again, some thoughts to keep in mind as we move further in this discussion. Here we have Vitale telling us that there is at least one benefit to be expected from the open assertion and publication of sound maxims, which is that even those who relish them the least are thereby laid under the necessity of keeping within some bounds, lest they should forfeit their character altogether. But to flatter ourselves with the vain expectation that men, especially men in power, will be inclined strictly to conform to the laws of nature, which is laws of nations, will be a gross mistake. Yet, to renounce all hope of making impression on some of them would be to give up mankind for lost. So these are all the thoughts that brim as we navigate where we are with international law, what's happening around the world, not only in Gaza or Russia, but also in Africa. Let's not forget that in Sudan, the war there has got to a level that many again invoking that word. They say it's got decidedly genocidal. It was always a difficult situation to begin with. There was a lull at some point. Now it's spiked back up. So it isn't only in Gaza, Russia, or the Middle East that we're seeing these challenges to the rule of international law. We are seeing them in other places too, including the DRC and Sudan. We need to keep all that in mind. But what do we do? Back to doctrinal foundations of international criminal jurisdiction. Some of you may recognize these two gentlemen on screen, Kai Ambos and Klaus Kress. Why do I have them up on your screen? Well, I have them up on your screen for a certain concept they introduced in the wake of the creation of the ICC, a discussion that exploded at some point, the doctrinal foundation of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Some would say, well, some said, well, it is based on the doctrine of a delegation, or rather delegation theory. I call that delegation hypothesis. But Ambos and Kress came up with a different view, which makes the most sense to me, which I fully subscribe to, and which I also will be amplifying in my own way in this discussion. Ambos and Kress introduced the idea of jus puniendi. The jus puniendi, they say, it explains the doctrinal foundation of the jurisdiction of the ICC. And what is jus puniendi, you will ask? Some of you may already know, but it's the idea that the international community has certain basic norms, fundamental norms, the violation of which would threaten that international order. Therefore, that now gives the international order the right to punish those who violate those basic norms of international law. And a community has that jus puniendi, national systems that explains the punitive powers of the national system. So jus puniendi, they bring it up to the international plane to explain the doctrinal foundation of the International Criminal Court. Now, that view, in my opinion, makes sense. It makes sense, and in my view, the delegation theory is inadequate to explain the foundations of the International Criminal Court. Jus puniendi, if you plot it, the reason why this makes the most sense is this. Let's keep in mind here, Article 38, 1D of the ICJ statute talks about the opinions of the most eminent jurists of the world as a subsidiary source of international law. Now, let's keep in mind that what that means, according to Baron Descamps, who crafted that provision in the PCIJ statute in 1920, explained the opinion of eminent jurists, not in terms of what individual jurists say, but the united opinions. In other words, in French, la doctrine, meaning when you have a concurrence of views of these eminent jurists on the same point, that can be a confident reference, a source of international law. So the views of eminent jurists of the various nations need to unite for us to see that as informing a source of international law. Now, moving that notion forward, the delegation theory is, in my view, not, and that can be defended. It's a new fangled theory in the sense that it is a theory that sprung up after 2002. Okay, we can even say 1998 by some scholars who think, okay, this is the way to explain the ICC jurisdiction. So it is a very new theory. Not every jurist agrees with that. Compare that to jus puniendi. Jus puniendi, we will see, if you plotted the writings of jurists going back from jus puniendi, Caiambos, Klaus Krest, moving it back, plotting it all the way back to the Roman Empire. That's how far back it goes. Scooping in along the way, moving backwards, views from the Renaissance scholastics, views from medieval scholars, and back to the Roman Empire, you will find jus puniendi. Oh, they didn't call it jus puniendi in those writings, but the description of what troubled them amounts to that. The idea of giving states the right to punish those who violate the basic norms of the international order. We see this in the writings of authorities that some of you see on the screen, from Livius, at the bottom of your screen there, that lived in 61 BC to 17 of the CE, to the writings of Cicero, to the writings of Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Archbishop of Milan, to the writings of Augustine, Hippo, Aquinas, Cajetan, and so forth. You plot their writings, one thing you see in their writings is the right of states to punish states or persons who violate what I call the preserval norms of the international order. Preserval in the sense that the whole idea of community is to preserve the individual members of that community. That's why Thomas Hobbes would say, well, people moved out of a state of nature to form a community to protect themselves, realizing that eventually we cannot rely on the force of our own power to sustain ourselves. Sooner or later, even the weak even the strong can grow weak. The empires, the mighty empires of the past, from the Roman Empire to the Persian Empire to the British Empire and so on, at some point were also powerful, but at the phase decline. So we cannot, we need to observe some basic norms that will protect each of us individually as human beings in society, or each nation individually as members of the international community. And by that reference as well, it becomes as well important to protect also the community itself so that it can continue to protect the individual members of it. So that is the norm of what I call the preserval norm of the international order. So those who violate that norm deserve or command the punishment of other states who are able to do so. So that concept of the right of states to punish those who violate the preservable norms of international order, you find is a synthesis of the writings of all the people who you see on the screen in expressing that notion in one form or the other. And that, in my view, you will find in the views of Kai Ambos and Klaus Kress, again, a view that I fully identify with, and I would even say express in my own way. We see that concept in the writing of Titus Livius, or Livy, who wrote about the jus fetialis, the law or the festal law during the Roman Empire that explained why or in what circumstances Rome could go to war against foreigners or a foreign state. The jus fetialis rested on the rituals of the fetial priests, who had the prerogative of deciding when it was okay for Rome to okay Rome going to war. That ritual was interesting. You had the group, the college of fetial priests, Collegium Fetialis, who would nominate one leader, the Pater Patratus. Their leader was spokesperson. When Rome was offended by another state, such as warranted raise the question of Rome exacting that punishment by going to war, the Pater Patratus would engage in this ritual that Livy and Cicero wrote about. He would, with a wooden band around his head, he would chant a repetitive form, certain positions or demands of Rome for reparation. He would rerum, I believe, repetitio was what it was called. He would recite the demand of Rome at the border of Rome and whatever state that was, or whatever city-state that was. He would recite Rome's demand at the border and repeat it upon crossing the border, on encountering the first person he would see on the territory of the offending state, and will continue reciting that incantation, as it were, of Rome's demand along the way towards the forum of that city, right, where the magistrates will be gathered. Again, you will keep repeating the same incantation. In case you didn't hear it the first time, here it is. Repetitively, you again table it to the forum. Now, if after 33 days, the state or the opposing state or city did not make demands, meet the demands of Rome, then the Pater Patratus would declare war and return to Rome and report to the emperor. So it was now up to the emperor to decide whether or not to go to war, because the Pater Patratus or the Collegium Fetialis have decided that it was okay for Rome to go to war. Now, if the emperor decided, yes, war it shall be, then the Pater Patratus would engage again, lances, javelin tipped with pig's blood into the territory of the other state, and that war was declared. Now, again, you'll see in all of that, the war was not automatic. The Pater Patratus was given the other side the opportunity to make amends so that war could be avoided. But if that wasn't to be, then there was going to be a war. Why would the Pater Patratus do that? All that incantation and ensuring that the rituals are observed, giving the opposing party opportunity to make amends to avoid war. There was a metaphysical rationale or explanation for the ritual. And that metaphysical was, well, they wanted to make sure that Jupiter, the god of law and order and protector of Rome, would not be offended by Rome engaging in war that would be deemed unjust. So that's the earliest incantation, the earliest, should I say, reference that I can give of the right of states to punish another state who is engaged in violation of norms. Now, Cicero, in his own writing, insisted that that right extended not only in relation to the offense caused Rome, and by the way, there's a sense that it wasn't only Rome that had this ritual, there are other city-states that had the same ritual, but that the demands or the right to punish in those circumstances was not only for what the offense that was caused the Rome or the state making the demand, but also that that right extended to punish violations caused third states or foreigners, because, as Cicero explained it, because of the bond of humanity that guided, that held everyone together. That bond of humanity required empathy for the pain of others, for the sufferings of others, including when others are attacked, to protect them. So you have that, again, Jus Fatialis being the earliest reference for the right of states to punish those who violate Jus Gentium at the time it was called in during the Roman time. Now we move it up to the era of the Christian fathers of the medieval era. Ambrose of Milan, who was the mentor and the bishop of Milan that actually baptized Augustine of Hippo and ordained Augustine, was Augustine's mentor. He too insisted that the right to punish, that is Ambrose now, the right to punish for violations caused included the right to punish for violations caused third states or foreigners. Augustine of Hippo, we know, is famous for the bellum justum theory, the theory of just war. Augustine of Hippo, he basically planted the seed of the Christian theory of just war, and St. Thomas Aquinas amplified it, and Thomas Cajetan, you see again on the bottom of the screen, gave the most authoritative interpretation of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologia, which included the just war theory. And at some point, Pope Leo XII insisted that all publications of St. Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologia must be accompanied by Cajetan's commentary on the Summa Theologia. So, and Augustine, in articulating the conditions of just war, the three conditions, you remember the first one is that war, it's not a private affair, it must be undertaken by sovereign authority. That's number one, auctoritas principis. And the second condition was that there must be a just cause for the war, justa causa, explained by some fold, some propter, aliquum copam, he said. In that second condition, again, the third condition, before I come back to the second condition, the third condition, there has to be the right intention, recta intentio. But back to the second condition, that there must be a just cause. That just cause included, as I said, that there must be some fault. And that fault was to be engaged when the party at fault or the state at fault failed to make amends for violations or the transgression that it had engaged in. So the war was not again automatic, but the transgressing party must have failed to make amends. Of course, if they made amends, then there would be no war. But if they failed to make amends, then war could be engaged in, and that war would be just. So that was, like, as I said, Cajetan explained that fault included faults or the violations, transgressions against third parties or third states and their citizens. So that was the Christian scholastics of the just war theory, again articulating the idea of the right of states to punish states or persons who violated the preservable norms of the international community. We also know that the Renaissance scholars of the School of Salamanca, University of Salamanca, also picked up on that theme from Francisco de Vitoria to Francisco Suarez, even Ayala, who was not part of the Salamanca school, also insisted that states had the right to punish other states who violated the preservable norms of international order. So there's no question about that in their writing. Now, moving it all up to Hugo Grotius and his contemporary, but a little younger than Hugo Grotius, sorry, a little older than Hugo Grotius, was Alberico Gentili. So Gentili and Grotius also wrote about the right of states to punish preservable norms of international law. They did. Vattel, this does something interesting. Vattel picks a quarrel, as it were, with Hugo Grotius 133 years later. Grotius had written that the right of states to punish other states for violations of the preservable norms of international law included, as Ambrose of Milan had said, as Cicero had said, as Cajetan had said, the right to punish for violations caused not only yourself, but also violations caused third states and their nationals. So Hugo Grotius restates that. Vattel was not comfortable with that restatement in that way. Vattel began by saying, hang on, no, you cannot extend that right for violations caused third states or their nationals. You can only limit it to those violations committed to you and your citizens, because to extend it in that way, protested Vattel, would be to open the door, I'm quoting now, open the door to all the passions of zealots and fanatics, and to give pretexts to without number to men with ambition. That was Vattel's protest against the extended version of the right of states to punish for transgressions against the preservable norms of international law. So, yes, according to Vattel, yes, there is that right. It exists, but only in relation to you and your nationals, not in relation, you cannot assert it to go to war against for violations committed to third states or their nationals. So that was Vattel. But then, sooner or later, in the same book, Vattel starts talking or starts writing about what he called a duty of mutual support, an obligation of mutual support. Obligation of mutual support. What does that mean? Well, obligation not only to give mutual support to third states and their nationals who are in peril from natural disasters and so on, but also obligation of mutual support for third states who are being crushed by a more powerful state. If you can rally to their support, you must, said Vattel. And then you begin to say, well, I thought a minute ago you were saying that Google Grotto shouldn't have extended that. So you have Vattel now returning to the idea that you can exact punishment for violations caused third states and their nationals. Even Vattel, the same Vattel, goes on to explain further why that makes sense. He said, well, the template of behavior, he said, would be what Odysseus or Heracles, for all the how he did good or service to humanity, to the world, by killing Antaeus, the giant king of Libya, killing Busiris, killing also Diomedes. Those are model behaviors, said Vattel. Of course, some of you may remember in Odysseus's, the labors of Odysseus, 12 labors, there was a story of Antaeus, who was this awful fellow who wrestled strangers and killed them and used their skulls to build temples for his father Dionysus. Okay. But Antaeus could not be, he was that champion wrestler. The secret to his power was that as long as he remained in contact with his mother, no one could ever defeat him. And his mother was who? Gaia, Earth, Mother Earth. So he was in contact with his mother. If you pinned him to the ground, he will crush you. If he was standing on the ground, he will crush you because he was in contact with his mother. Then Odysseus figured out his secret and then was able to defeat him by holding him aloft, not letting him touch the ground and crushing him in a bear hug. So Vattel said that was a good thing. Diomedes, you may remember again one of the labors of Odysseus was to capture the mares of Diomedes of Thrace. The horses did not like feeding on grains and oat, preferred human flesh, which Diomedes indulged them in by killing people and feeding their flesh to the horses. Again, Odysseus was able to defeat him in a wrestling match, killed him, and fed him to his own horse. Vattel said all that was good, models of behavior as examples of why it was all right to that duty of mutual support, helping third states in trouble from peril. So that again is the story of the right of states to punish transgressions or preserve norms of international law that Ambrose and Christ called jus puniendi. Hans Kelsen updates the theory by telling us that, well, that right exists, and when it engages the right of states to punish for preservable norms, transgressions against preservable norms of the international order, that the states are authorized to do it on their own if they can, or in compact with other states, if they, to the extent possible. But if they can form an alliance to do it, that's great. If they can do it on their own, that's great. But even when they do it on their own, said Hans Kelsen, they're doing it on behalf of the international community. And a state that engages in that right to punish preservable norms of international law is doing so individually, but on behalf of the international community. In other words, as an agent of the international community. That was Hans Kelsen for you. So the point again I make is in all of this, the synthesis in all of this comes together in saying that the right of states to punish preserve norms of international law. It's an old norm. It is what we may call a customary principle of international law established since time immemorial. So it is what you see in the Rome Statute. Now, we have seen that, let me let me get out of screen sharing mode here. Give me a minute, please.
Chile, if I may ask, we do want to leave some time for questions.
All right, let me.
You could sum up and then we could have a few questions from the audience. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me do that. Thanks. So to sum it all up, what has that got to do with the ICC? Well, I've already explained it, but remember the right to punish need not engage war, need not involve war. It only happens if we could not, you only engage war if you could not avoid it. Suarez made that point very clear. So did Ellery Stowell. So did even St. Augustine in the second condition of just war. And closer to our own time, the man whom we encountered in the beginning, Robert H. Jackson, explained that as the basis of the Nuremberg processes, that you need not engage war to punish, you can use judicial methods to do so, and that was what the Nuremberg process was all about. And that is, as we all know, the modern successor of the Nuremberg processes would be the International Criminal Court. I'll leave it at that stage and take any questions you may have. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. And now we'll open the floor to questions. We'll start with Professor Shani.
Thank you very much, Professor Abosuji. That was very interesting, and you really, I mean, I've learned a lot of things I actually didn't know about the origins of use Penundi. The question is that I have is there are actually two questions here. One is the fact that this is it possible to maintain that the Rome Statute actually adopts both theories? Why do we have to actually choose? Can't we say that with regard to Security Council, we do have this idea of broader use penundi, and with regard to state-based consent, we apply the other theory. And you recall, of course, that during the negotiations of the Rome Statute, there was a specific proposal to allow custody-based jurisdiction. That was not adopted. Had that been adopted, I think you would have had a much stronger case to maintain. And we know that some states have basically taken this delegation theory, also some experts. So this is one. And secondly, in terms of influencing states and getting, I think it is somewhat difficult to persuade states that they have to do something just on the basis of arguments that belong to legal theory. And the question is, going forward, how do you see this matter resolved when you have a division between some states and some scholars take one position, the other states and the other scholars take another position, and we are finding ourselves stuck in somewhat of a logjam. So maybe for the court, at least at this initial stage of it's still a very young institutions, is it worth a while to drive this point, or maybe leave it for a later point in time when we have greater consensus around this issue?
We'll take one more question now from a historian.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very interesting talk. I'm a historian of IHL, among other things. So what the word that I didn't hear in your fascinating presentation, or if I misheard, I beg your apology, is God. And for a good reason, because at least the Christian portion of the intellectual evolution you presented is very much based on divine law, or at least on interpretation of divine law. And when you are based on natural law or divine law, no matter how you call it, you give a lot of power to the elite that interprets, may it be Catholic theologian or experts in IHL. So in the 20th century, it's a secularized mythology, which is based on divine law, which is no longer divine. And now the question is, without the divine origin, from where the elite that interprets IHL actually derives its authority.
Okay, would you like to refer to those
Yes.
questions?
Yes, very, very much. Again, this is again a wonderful question. Thank you for asking them so we can enrich the discussion. First of all, to the first question about can't we have both delegation theory and jus puniendi? The one problem is this. My preference would be no. The people remember this. Some people who push the delegation theory come from a good place. They want to explain, they're looking for a rational basis of the jurisdiction of the ICC. Now, I'm not sure that they had considered and rejected the punitive theories that I just explained. I know that they have not. They did not, because I read those writings. They came up with their own original theories to explain the Rome Statute, right? Now, again, some of them had good intentions, no question about that, trying to make sense of that jurisdiction. The difficulty, of course, is that theory becomes a Trojan horse, in a sense. Trojan horse in the manner of, well, you've all had the argument, well, nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you don't have. So if you are delegating, then you can only give what you're allowed to have. That's what you can delegate. Meaning that, well, states never had the right to punish other states, but that's wrong. We've seen in the theory of just my discussion this morning, they always had the right to do that. So that cancels out the delegation theory. And I also am a great fan of Hans Kelsen's view that when states act on their own, they're actually acting on behalf of the international community. So it's not the other way around. It is not the other way around. Kelsen was clear in saying that that right is a monopoly of the international community. So that cannot, again, in that sense, coexist with the delegation theory that has it in the opposite direction. So delegation theory for me doesn't work. It also doesn't work in the sense that why the Hans Kelsen theory makes more sense is when you read the reparation case of the ICJ, it becomes clear that the international organization is not the agent of any of its members. ICJ is quite clear in that. Statute of the Rome Statute, for instance, gives the ICC an independent personality in international law. It also, the delegation theory also does not reckon with the idea of a judicial organ, a court of law, exercising independence. So you cannot say that a court of law that necessarily exercises independent judgment is the agent of anybody. So delegation theory, in my view, doesn't work. I rely more on the doctrinal theory that I explained. Now, the second question, again, that's a very, very fascinating question that we now, in a discussion that goes back to not only Cicero and Livy talking about Jupiter, or wondering about Jupiter, and then tracing it all the way to St. Augustine and so on, are we priding ourselves, are we giving all that power to the divinity of law? No, not at all. Let's remember here that the definition of customary international law is the consistent practice of states that is law regarding. So states are doing something repeatedly, thinking that they are following legal guidelines. In that sense, in that definition, the motive for the legal guideline becomes irrelevant. Whether the legal guideline was something, oh, God wants me to obey the law, versus the sovereign wants me to obey the law. All that matters, in my view, is that I am obeying the law, regardless of the impulse for doing that. So it is a practice that counts, not the motivation for practice in that sense. Thanks.
Our time is really up. People have been here for 2 full days, and I think that was a really fitting end. I think, will you all join me once again in thanking our lecturer for a wonderful lecture? And I thank you especially for your initial remarks and for agreeing to be with us and to address us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.